He paid $730,000 for the murder of 5 people. But in the year 2025, Donald Trump decides to pardon this man. My name is Mr. Darkweb, and today I'm going to tell you why the creator of Silk Road, the largest marketplace in the history of the Darknet, was actually pardoned. On the 21st of January, 2025, an event occurred that shocked the crypto community, law enforcement agencies, and ordinary Americans. The President of the United States signed a full and unconditional pardon for a man who had served 11 years of 2 life sentences, plus 40 years without parole. Ross Ulbricht has been released from prison. Today, I want to share with you all the information I managed to find about this case. Some of the materials were in the public domain. Some I had to search for in old Darknet archives, and some I had to reconstruct bit by bit from the surviving Silk Road logs. What I found made me take a fresh look at the story of a man who some call a visionary of digital freedom, while others call him a cold-blooded drug lord of the internet age. But the most interesting part began when I found the correspondence of the terrible pirate Roberts, as Ulbricht called himself on the Darknet. These messages reveal a remarkable transformation. A brilliant university graduate with a degree in physics turns first into an anarchist philosopher, then into the creator of an underground empire, and finally into a man willing to pay in bitcoins to eliminate threats to his business. Trump, in announcing the pardon, called those who secured Ulbricht's conviction scum and crazy. He talked about weaponizing the government against political opponents, but the real reason for the pardon is much deeper and has to do with how perceptions of cryptocurrencies and digital freedom have changed in recent years. 600,000 signatures on a petition for Ross's release isn't just a number. It's an army of people who see his story as more than just a crime story. To understand why Ulbricht's pardon was possible, and even inevitable, we need to go back to the very beginning. To the moment when the 27-year-old physicist from Texas decided that the economic theory of the Austrian school could change the world. He genuinely believed he was creating a tool to liberate humanity from the tyranny of the state. Instead, he created a machine that processed 1.5 million transactions worth over $200 million in 2.5 years. The story of Silk Road is not just a story about drugs on the internet. It is a story about how noble ideas become an excuse for any action. It's about how freedom without borders becomes anarchy, how genius and madness go hand in hand in the digital age. I will begin with the moment that determined Ross Ulbricht's entire future destiny. It was not the day of his arrest in the San Francisco library, or the launch of Silk Road, or even when he first read Ludwig von Mises. The turning point came in 2010, when Ulbricht realized one simple thing. Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin could be used as more than just digital money. It was the perfect tool for creating a parallel economy outside the control of any government. In the archives I've been researching, there is a record of him from that period. Ulbricht wrote about wanting to create an economic simulation where people could experience firsthand what it was like to live in a world without the systematic use of force. Beautiful words. But only a few months passed between writing his manifesto and the first batch of psilocybin mushrooms he grew himself to sell on his site. The Mises Institute, referenced by Ulbricht in every other post on the forums, preaches the free market as the highest form of human interaction. Voluntary transactions between consenting parties is the ideal of libertarianism. Ross has taken this idea to the absolute. If 2 parties voluntarily want to exchange bitcoins for heroin, who has the right to stop them? The state? But the state, according to Ulbricht's philosophy, is just a gang with a monopoly on violence. The paradox is that in creating a violence-free world, Ulbricht eventually resorted to violence himself. Or rather, he tried to. The $700,000 for 5 contract murders is not a prosecutor's fiction. I found the original negotiation logs. The dreaded Pirate Roberts was coldly discussing the details of taking out a former site administrator who threatened to leak user data. He haggled over price, demanded proof of completion. The creepiest thing about these emails is the tone. No emotion, no doubt, just business, removing a threat to the free market. The man who started with the idea of ending the use of coercion and aggression among mankind ordered murders as easily as the average person orders a pizza. The truth that supporters of Ross's release don't like to bring up is that none of these murders took place. Not because Ulbricht changed his mind. It's just that the people he paid to do the murders turned out to be crooks. They took the money and disappeared. Or more interestingly, they turned out to be undercover federal agents. The story of the corrupt agents is a separate chapter of this case. Carl Mark Force of the Drug Enforcement Administration and Sean Bridges of the Secret Service didn't just investigate Silk Road. They were stealing bitcoins, blackmailing Ulbricht, playing a double game. Force even sold information about the investigation to Pirate Roberts himself. Both eventually went to prison, but their crimes were hushed up at Ross's trial. Between the lines of official documents, you can read an amazing story about how a billion-dollar Darknet site worked with only a handful of administrators, how the FBI could not find the servers hidden in Iceland for months, and how one careless post on a forum under the nickname Altoid led to the collapse of the entire empire. But before I talk about how exactly horrible Pirate Roberts was caught, we need to understand who Ross Ulbricht was before he became America's most wanted cybercriminal. Records of student Ross William Ulbricht have been preserved in the archives of the University of Texas at Dallas. Honors student, scholarship recipient, bachelor's degree in physics in the year 2006. Teachers described him as a brilliant mind with extraordinary potential. In high school, he achieved the rank of Eagle Boy Scout, the highest award in the Boy Scouts of America, awarded to less than 4% of the members. From what I've been able to find about his youth, I have a portrait of the ideal American boy. Born on the 27th of March in the year 984, grew up in a decent family, participated in school science projects. He played sports. No trouble with the law, no teenage rebellion. Neighbors remembered him as a polite young man who helped the elderly with their shopping. After his undergraduate studies, Ross enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania for a master's degree in materials science. And this is where the first turning point begins. In the year 2009, he receives his master's degree, but something in him had already changed. In personal notes from that period, later seized by the FBI, Ulbricht wrote of disillusionment with academic science. He called it disconnected from real life, too slow, constrained by bureaucracy and grants. It was then that Ross discovered the Austrian School of Economics. Ludwig von Mises was a revelation to him. Unlike physics, where every statement has to be proved by experiments, the Austrian school offered elegant logical constructions of human activity. No maths, no formulas, pure philosophy of freedom. Ulbricht began to devour libertarian literature with a manic obsession. Murray Rothbard, Friedrich Hayek, Ayn Rand. He read everything. In his email correspondence of the time, There are constant references to the Mises Institute. He even added a link to their website in his email signature, russellbricht@gmail.com, the very email that would later ruin him. But just reading wasn't enough. Ross wanted action. He gave up a promising scientific career and tried to become an entrepreneur. His first attempt, day trading stocks, failed. The market was more complicated than Austrian theory predicted. Second attempt, a video game company with a friend, failed again. No one bought the games. Then Ulbricht created Good Wagon Books, an online used bookstore. Together with his friend Yulia, they collected books at garage sales and resold them online. The business was barely breaking even. In an interview with a local newspaper, Ross spoke of a noble mission to give old books a new life, to reduce waste. But behind the pretty words was disappointment. He was 26 years old with 2 university degrees, and he was selling old books for pennies. In a personal diary from the year 2010, which would later be introduced as evidence in court, Ulbricht wrote a frank entry. He confessed that he felt like a failure. All his attempts to change the world had failed. The system was stronger. Government regulation, taxes, licenses all stifled free enterprise. You had to find a way around the system, not play by its rules. And that's when he found out about Bitcoin. Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin white paper in 2008 year, but the cryptocurrency did not become widespread until 2010. For Ulbricht, it was an epiphany. Here it was. The technology that would enable a true free market, anonymous transactions, no government controls, no intermediary banks, pure interaction between buyer and seller. But Bitcoin solved only half the problem: payments. The issue of anonymity of the trading platform itself remained. And this is where Tor, a network for anonymous access to the internet originally developed by the U.S. military, comes into the picture. The irony is that Ulbricht used technology created by the state to fight the state. In the autumn of 2010, Ross started writing code. His notes from that period are preserved in the logs we found. He worked like a man possessed, 15 to 16 hours a day. He studied PHP, he studied cryptography, he studied security systems. Good Wagon Books was a cover. He was supposedly in the book business by day, building a Darknet empire by night. An interesting detail from his notes is that Ulbricht realized from the beginning that he was creating something illegal. He had no illusions. In one of his notes, it was explicitly written, "If the authorities found out what I was doing, I would be imprisoned for life." But he believed he was fighting for what was right, for freedom, for the future of mankind. The philosophical rationale was simple, and in its simplicity, brilliant. If an adult wants to use drugs, that is their choice. The state has no right to dictate what can and cannot be put into one's own body. The war on drugs is a war on personal freedom. Silk Road will be an instrument of peaceful resistance to tyranny. By January 2011, the site was ready for launch. But Ulbricht needed a starter product, and here he made a decision that shows how deeply he had immersed himself in his philosophy. Ross began growing psilocybin mushrooms himself. There are photos of his improvised laboratory in the case file. Professional equipment, sterile containers, special lamps. The former physicist approached the cultivation of hallucinogens with scientific precision. He even kept a log of his experiments, optimizing the conditions for maximum yield. On the 27th of January 2011, Silk Road began operations. The first product on the site was mushrooms grown by Ulbricht himself. The price was 10 bitcoins per eighth of an ounce. At the exchange rate of the time, that was about $10. Today, the same 10 bitcoins would be worth $1 million. But Ross had a problem. He had built the perfect anonymous site, but no one knew about it. It needed publicity. And that's where Ulbricht made a mistake that would land him in a jail cell 2 years later. He created an account on the Bitcoin Talk forum under the nickname Altoid. On the 29th of January, just 2 days after launch, Altoid published a post. It was an innocent post saying that he came across an interesting site on the Tor network called Silk Road. Mall, you can buy anything for Bitcoins there. It looked like a random find by an ordinary user. No one paid attention, except for one person at the US IRS, who 2 years later would link this post to a real person. In the following weeks, Silk Road began to grow slowly. The first sellers, besides Ulbricht himself, appeared. Cocaine from Colombia, MDMA from Holland, prescription drugs from Canada. Ross watched his brainchild come to life and felt like the creator of a new world. In personal correspondence from that period, he compared himself to the hero of an Ayn Rand novel, creating a utopia in defiance of the system. But in the first few months, a problem arose for which the idealistic Ulbricht was unprepared. Products that did not fit his philosophy of freedom began to appear on the site. Child pornography, killer services, stolen credit cards. Ross faced the paradox of absolute freedom. If everything is allowed, then the most disgusting things are allowed. And this is where the first transformation of the terrible pirate Roberts took place. He started making rules. He banned child pornography, that was morally easy. Banned the sale of guns, harder, but he justified it on the grounds that guns were used for violence. But most interestingly, he banned the sale of fake private documents while allowing fake government documents. The logs I found have his explanation of this policy. Private contracts are sacrosanct in libertarian philosophy. Forging a university degree is defrauding a private institution and other private individuals who put their trust in that degree. A fake passport, on the other hand, is simply a way of circumventing the illegal requirements of the tyrant state. By the summer of 2011, Silk Road had become a phenomenon. Senator Chuck Schumer publicly demanded that the site be shut down. The FBI launched an investigation. The media dubbed the site the Amazon of drugs. And Ross Ulbricht, sitting in a cheap rented flat in San Francisco, was running an empire worth millions of dollars under a pseudonym taken from a favorite childhood book. By the autumn of 2011, Silk Road was processing dozens of orders daily. Ross Ulbricht sat in his flat and watched the numbers grow on his laptop screen. Each transaction brought in between 2 and 10% commission. Bitcoins were accumulating in his wallet at a rate he could not have imagined 6 months ago. In the archives I researched, there were internal records of the site's growth. By the end of the first year, Silk Road had 30,000 registered users. New sellers were appearing every day. The geography was expanding. Heroin from Afghanistan, cocaine from Bolivia, synthetics from clandestine labs in Europe. The dreaded pirate Roberts ran the global network from the comfort of his computer chair. But what was most surprising was not the scale of the operation, but the culture that developed around the site. On the Silk Road forums, there were philosophical discussions about the nature of freedom. Sellers and buyers discussed the quality of goods with the same seriousness with which they discuss electronics on Amazon. There were reliability ratings, review systems, even a dispute resolution service. Ulbricht created more than just a black market. He built a full-fledged economic ecosystem with its own rules, reputation, and social ties. In correspondence from the period, Pirate Roberts regularly quoted Ludwig von Mises, explaining to the sellers the importance of honesty in free trade. The paradox was that they were dealing in substances that in the ordinary world carried prison sentences. The money flowed. By the year 2012, Ulbricht was earning tens of thousands of dollars a month. But he didn't spend it on luxuries. He lived modestly, rented cheap accommodation, didn't buy a car. That's because every big spend left a trail, and traces in his position were deadly. Because in parallel with Silk Road's growth, the investigation grew. After Senator Schumer's speech in the summer of 2011, the federal government threw an army at the site's creator. The FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the IRS, the Customs Service, even the Secret Service all wanted to catch the dread Pirate Roberts. It became a matter of prestige, but Ulbricht proved elusive. Silk Road's servers were hidden somewhere on the Darknet, IP address masked through the Tor network. Payments went through Bitcoin mixers, which mixed the cryptocurrency so that it was impossible to trace the sender. Pirate Roberts himself never showed his face, never gave his real name, was only a voice on forums. In the investigation documents I found, there are records of how agents spent months trying to breach the site's security system. They went undercover as buyers and sellers. They tried to hack the servers. They analyzed Bitcoin transactions. But each time, they hit a wall of anonymity. Meanwhile, Ross was turning into a different person. In the personal notes of the beginning of the year 2012, a transformation is noticeable. Philosophical reflections on freedom are replaced by paranoid notes on security. Ulbricht wrote down rules of behavior for himself. Never use his real name on the internet. Encrypt all files. Destroy old hard drives. Trust no one. He hired a team of administrators to help moderate the forums and solve technical problems. But even with them, Pirate Roberts communicated only through encrypted channels. No one knew who was behind the alias. Some admins weren't even sure if DPR was one person and not a group. As the empire grew, so did the stakes. Silk Road was handling $1 million a week by the year 2013. Ulbricht earned $80 million in commissions, but every Bitcoin earned increased the risk. The bigger the site got, the more attention it attracted, and the more desperate the investigation became. And then the threat started. In March of 2013, one of Silk Road's first administrators, operating under the nickname Chronic Pain, fell into the clutches of law enforcement in Utah. His real name was Curtis Clark Green. Drug Enforcement Administration agents arrested him while trying to cash a large sum of money. Green was terrified. He knew too much about the inner workings of the site. Ulbricht learnt of the arrest through his sources. Logs of correspondence from that period show how Pirate Roberts first thought about physically eliminating the threat. Up until that point, all of his activities had been virtual. Digital money, digital goods, digital freedom. But the arrest of a real person who could reveal the real Ross Ulbricht brought the situation into the physical world, and this is where a man who called himself Knob came on the scene. He contacted the terrible Pirate Roberts and offered his services to solve delicate problems. The very chronic pain that posed a threat, Knob can fix it. For a fee, of course. The original logs I found in the old archives preserved correspondence between DPR and Knob. It started cautiously. Ulbricht asked how reliable the services were. Knob answered in a professional, business-like manner. He quoted prices. He explained the methods. And then Pirate Roberts asked a direct question. How much does it cost to eliminate a person in a way that makes it look like an accident? Knob quoted a figure of $80,000. Ulbricht haggled, offered 50. In the end, they agreed on 80,000 in bitcoins. The deal was concluded on the 30th of March, 2013. A philosopher of liberty who opposed the use of force just ordered an assassination. There's not a shred of doubt or a hint of moral turpitude in the correspondence we found, just business correspondence. Knob even sent Pirate Roberts photos as proof of order fulfillment. Chronic pain was allegedly strangled in his home. The photo was of a body lying on the floor. Ross Ulbricht sent the remaining bitcoins and wrote a short message. "I don't want to hurt people, but sometimes you have to protect what you've built." It was the beginning of the end, because Chronic Pain hadn't actually been killed. Curtis Green was alive and in custody, and Knob turned out to be a corrupt DEA agent named Carl Mark Force. He fabricated a photo of the corpse, got $80,000 in bitcoins, and put it in his own pocket. But Ulbricht didn't know that. He thought he had crossed the line and survived. He thought he could continue to defend his empire by any means necessary. And when a new threat appeared in the spring of 2013, he did not hesitate. This time, the blackmailer demanded $1 million, threatening to disclose Silk Road users' data. Pirate Roberts again got in touch with those who offered to solve the problem radically. This time, the price was higher, $500,000. But Ulbricht paid without bargaining, and then another order, and another. By the summer of 2013, his correspondence contained the names of 5 people, for the elimination of whom he spent $730,000. A brilliant physicist who dreamed of ending violence in human society has turned into a man who buys death with the same ease with which others buy groceries in the supermarket. But while Ulbricht thought he was in control, the noose around him was tightening. Because an IRS agent named Gary Alford was doing something no one else had thought to do before. He was digging through old forum posts, and one day he came across a post by a user called Altoid, posted in January 2011. Gary Alford was not your typical federal agent. Working for the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, he specialized not in chases and shootouts, but in analyzing digital traces. While his colleagues from the FBI and DEA were trying to hack into Silk Road servers, Alford was doing what he did best, digging through internet archives. In June of 2013, he was looking through old posts on the Bitcoin Talk forum. It was a routine investigation, one of hundreds of Bitcoin transaction cases. Alford was looking for mentions of Silk Road in early discussions of the cryptocurrency, and came across a post by user Altoid from the 29th of January, 2011. The message looked innocent. It was just a person sharing a find, an interesting site on the Tor network where you can buy anything for bitcoins. No pretense of owning the site. Just an ordinary curious user. But it was the date that caught Alford's eye. 29th January, just 2 days after Silk Road launched. Too fast for a chance find. The agent started looking for other posts by this user, and found something interesting. On the 11th of October 2011, the same Altoid posted an ad on another forum. He was looking for a programmer to work on a Bitcoin startup. At the end of the post was a request to contact by email, russellbrick@gmail.com. Alford reread the address 3 times. Ross Ulbricht. The full name in the email of the man who had advertised Silk Road in its early days. The investigation files I've been looking at have records of what happened next. Alford ran the name through the databases. Ross William Ulbricht, born 27th March 1984, bachelor's degree in physics, master's degree in material science. Last known residence, San Francisco. No criminal record, no criminal history. At first glance, he seems like a regular guy. But when agents started digging deeper, the picture changed. Ross's social media profiles were full of libertarian quotes, links to the Mises Institute, discussions of the Austrian School of Economics, posts about how the war on drugs is a human rights violation. Coincidence? Alford didn't think so. He passed the information on to the FBI. Agents began surveillance on Ross Ulbricht in the summer of 2013, but mere suspicion was not enough to make an arrest. There had to be proof. A direct link between Ross and the dread pirate Roberts. And then a series of events took place that led to the denouement. In July 2013, the U.S. Border Patrol intercepted a package from Canada addressed to Josh Teray at the airport. Inside were fake IDs, 9 of them, different names, but the same photo. The face in the photos belonged to Ross Ulbricht. Homeland Security agents paid a visit to the delivery address. The door was opened by a young man who introduced himself as Josh. The agents explained the situation with the parcel. Josh seemed nervous, said he had no idea what it was about. Maybe there was some kind of mistake. But then, trying to fill the pause, he made a fatal mistake. He began to speculate that, hypothetically, such documents could be ordered on the Darknet. For example, on that Silk Road site everyone was talking about, they say they sell anything. The agents glanced around. The average person who got a visit from the feds because of forged documents wouldn't have mentioned Silk Road, especially not so casually, as if it were common knowledge. After they left, they ran the address. The flat was rented in the name of Ross Ulbricht. The noose was tightening. But the FBI still needed hard evidence. They needed to prove that Ross and DPR were the same person, and that required catching him at a computer, authorized as a Silk Road administrator. In parallel, the FBI's technical team was working on another task, to find the physical location of the servers. Despite Ulbricht's precautions, the servers existed somewhere, and in July of 2013, the agents succeeded in the unbelievable. Using a vulnerability in the site's code, they identified the IP address of one of the servers, Reykjavik, Iceland. On July 23rd, Icelandic police seized a server at a local data center at the request of the FBI. The hard drives contained a complete copy of Silk Road, all transactions, all correspondence, all logs, including the login logs of an admin named Dread Pirate Roberts. Among thousands of records, the agents found what they were looking for: the IP address from which DPR regularly logged in. The address was not masked through Tor, an obvious security flaw. Tech experts figured out the location: Momi Toby's Cafe in San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood. The FBI began a 24-hour surveillance. Agents filmed a man who sat for hours with a laptop in the corner of a cafe. The face in the photos matched the one on the forged documents. Ross Ulbricht, the owner of the largest Darknet site in the world, ran his empire from an ordinary cafe a few blocks from his home. By the end of September, the FBI had enough evidence for an arrest warrant, but there was still a problem. Ulbricht never left his laptop unattended. It had an encrypted hard drive that automatically locked when the lid was closed. If you gave him a second to react, he would close the computer, and all evidence would disappear behind the encryption wall. It had to be perfectly synchronized. Grab Ross and the laptop at the same time, without giving him time to even blink. Agents studied his habits for weeks. Ross often worked at the Glen Park Public Library. He'd come in after lunch, sit at a table in the corner, open his laptop, and immerse himself in his work for hours. The perfect place to make an arrest is a public space where you can fake a distraction. On the 1st of October 2013, Ross Ulbricht came to the library as usual. He opened his Dell XPS, logged into the Silk Road system. The screen displayed the admin panel. He was the terrible pirate Roberts, and no one around him even knew it. There were several undercover FBI agents in the reading room. 2 were pretending to be a couple, a man and a woman talking quietly by the shelves of books. 3 more were disguised as regular library patrons. They were all waiting for the signal. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a couple near the bookshelves suddenly started arguing loudly. The woman shouted at the man, waving her arms. Library patrons turned round at the noise. Ross was distracted for a second, looking up from the screen. At that moment, an agent sitting at a nearby table grabbed Ulbricht's laptop with a jerk. Simultaneously, 2 others threw Ross to the floor, pinning his hands behind his back. It all happened in 3 seconds. Silk Road's admin page was burning on the laptop screen. The login is Dread Pirate Roberts, full access to all of the site's data. Ross Ulbricht didn't even have time to hit the exit button. As they lifted him off the floor and handcuffed him, the agents read him his rights. Ross was silent. The arrest file records the only thing he said. "Good job. You got me." An hour later, the FBI searched his flat. They found thumb drives with backups of Silk Road data. They found a personal diary documenting his creation of the site, found millions of dollars in bitcoins in encrypted wallets, and they found the one thing that finally buried any chance of an acquittal: logs of correspondence about contract killings. The same night Silk Road was shut down, a message from the FBI appeared on the home page. This hidden site had been confiscated. 1 million users around the world saw this and realized that the empire of the terrible pirate Roberts had fallen. Ross Ulbricht spent his first night in a prison cell. He was 29 years old. A trial, a conviction, and 11 years behind bars lay ahead of him. But on that October night, he didn't yet know that his story was just beginning. On the 4th of February, 2015, the courtroom of the Southern District of New York was packed. Journalists, crypto enthusiasts, libertarians, law enforcement officials, and the curious were all eager to see the end of the horrible pirate Roberts story. Ross Ulbricht sat at the defense table wearing a prison robe. He was 30 years old, but he looked older. 15 months in pretrial detention had done its work. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented such a mountain of evidence that the defense did not even try to deny the obvious. Ross created Silk Road. Ross was horrible pirate Roberts. Ross made tens of millions of dollars in commissions from illegal transactions. All of this was proven by the logs from his own laptop confiscated at the library, but the defense tried to play on a different pitch. Joshua Drattel, Ulbricht's lawyer, was building a line that his client had set up the site as a philosophical experiment, but then handed over management to other people. That the real horrible pirate Roberts was not one person, but several administrators who used that alias. That Ross simply took the blame for other people's crimes. Judge Catherine Forrest was not impressed by this argument. She dismissed most of the defense evidence, saying it was irrelevant. The prosecution methodically went through every aspect of Silk Road's operations. Drug deals, proven. Money laundering through Bitcoin, proven. Hacking into computer systems to protect the site, proven. And then prosecutors moved on to the toughest charge of all, a topic that turned the case from a story about drug dealing on the internet into a story about a man willing to kill to protect his business. In the court files I've been studying, there are transcripts of the reading out of correspondence about the contract killings. Prosecutor Serena Hoffman read the messages aloud. Cold, business-like discussions about the price of human life, bargaining over methods of killing, demands for photographic evidence of order fulfillment. There was absolute silence in the hall as he read out. People listened as the 27-year-old physicist, who dreamed of a world without violence, negotiated the elimination of 5 people, $730,000 in bitcoins, 5 lives, which he was willing to buy with the same ease with which one buys groceries. The defense tried to minimize the damage. Drattel pointed out that no murder had actually been committed, that those who offered the services turned out to be fraudsters or undercover agents, that a person could not be tried for an offense that had not taken place. But prosecutors counterattacked hard. Hoffman explained to the jury that the absence of bodies did not make Ulbricht any less guilty. He paid for the murders. He wanted those people dead. The fact that the perpetrators turned out to be crooks was purely coincidental, not a credit to Ross. And then a detail emerged in the case that became one of the most controversial moments of the entire trial. A story of corrupt agents. Carl Mark Force of the Drug Enforcement Administration and Sean Bridges of the Secret Service were involved in the Silk Road investigation. But in parallel, they were running their own game. Force went undercover to communicate with the terrible pirate Roberts, posing as the same knob who was offering troubleshooting services. It was to him that Ulbricht had paid $80,000 to kill Curtis Green. Force not only fabricated the photos of the corpse, he stole the money for himself. Meanwhile, Bridges stole bitcoins directly from the confiscated Silk Road wallets. Both agents were arrested, pleaded guilty, and received prison sentences. Force got 6.5 years. Bridges, almost 8. But here's the interesting thing. The story was barely mentioned at Ulbricht's trial. Judge Forrest barred the defense from discussing the agent's corruption in detail, saying it was irrelevant to the defendant's guilt. It later became one of the grounds for the appeals. Ross's lawyers argued that corrupt agents could have planted evidence or distorted the investigation. But in February 2015, the judge was adamant. She conducted the trial rigidly, rejecting most of the defense motions. The jury saw only one picture. A brilliant programmer had created a criminal empire and was willing to kill to protect it. On the 4th of February, after a week of deliberations, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all 7 counts, directing an ongoing criminal organization, conspiracy to distribute drugs, money laundering, hacking into computer systems, conspiracy to traffic in forged documents. Ross Ulbricht sat motionless as the verdict was read out. His mother Lynn was crying in the audience. His father put his arm around her shoulders. Journalists were already making headlines about the fall of the Darknet king. But the real shock was ahead, because the jury's verdict is only a guilty plea. It's the judge who determines the sentence, and on the 29th of May, 2015, Judge Catherine Forrest announced a verdict that shocked even those who had expected a harsh sentence. Double life plus 40 years without parole. In fact, Ross Ulbricht should have died in prison. He was 31 years old, and he received the sentence usually given to serial killers and terrorists, for crimes in which not a drop of blood was spilled, for a website on the internet. Judge Forrest explained her position at length and in detail. She talked about the need for an example, that the internet is not a law-free zone, that Ulbricht had created a tool to spread death and destruction, about how his philosophy of freedom has led to real overdose victims. Forrest specifically emphasized contract killings. Although Ulbricht was not formally charged with attempted murder in this trial, the judge took those actions into account as an aggravating factor. She quoted his own words from his correspondence. "I don't want to hurt people, but sometimes you have to defend what you've built." In her opinion, this phrase revealed Ulbricht's true nature. A man who put his business before human life. A man who hid behind a philosophy of freedom, but was ready to use violence at the most critical moment. When Forrest finished, there was a sepulchral silence in the room. Ross got his chance to make his final statement. He stood up, turned to the audience. His voice trembled. He spoke of regret, about how he never meant any harm, about how Silk Road was created with good intentions. He apologized to everyone who had been hurt, but the judge was adamant. The sentence was upheld. Ross was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He was sent to a maximum security federal prison, where America's most dangerous criminals are held. There is an interesting detail in the case files I have studied, a comparison of sentences. Other Silk Road administrators received significantly lesser sentences. Peter Nash, who moderated under the nickname Same Semi But Different, 7 years. Andrew Michaels Jones, another administrator, 4 years. Roger Thomas Clark, who administered the biggest deals, 6 years. But Ross refused to cooperate. He tried to fight to the end, and he got a sentence that was greater than the sum of all the other Silk Road sentences combined. The lawyers immediately filed an appeal. They pointed out the unfairness of the trial, that the judge did not allow the corruption of the agents to be discussed, that the contract killings should not have been counted because they had not been formally charged, that the sentence was disproportionate to the offense. In 2017, the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit dismissed all appeals. In 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case. All legal avenues had been exhausted. Ross Ulbricht remained in prison, but his story didn't end there. Because outside, in the free world, a movement had begun that would lead to the most unexpected ending to this story in 7 years. 11 years, 4,015 days. Ross Ulbricht spent them in maximum security federal prisons, first in New York, then Pennsylvania, then Arizona. 2 by 3 meter cell, an hour's walk a day, no computers, no internet. For a man who had built a digital empire, it was a special form of torture. But on the outside, his story continued to live on. Ross's mother, Lynn Ulbricht, launched the Free Ross campaign immediately after the verdict. She traveled the country, spoke at conferences, and gave interviews. She spoke of her son not as a crime boss, but as a young idealist who had paid too high a price for his beliefs. A petition for Ross's release was signed by over 600,000 people. These were not just random signatures. Congressmen, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and prominent crypto enthusiasts were among the supporters. Thomas Massey, a Kentucky Republican, publicly called Ross's sentence cruel and unfair. The libertarian community has made Ulbricht its symbol. He became a martyr in the state's war against individual freedom. At Bitcoin enthusiast conferences, his portrait hung alongside quotes about freedom and anonymity. People wore t-shirts that said "Free Ross." But critics pointed to the other side of the story. $730,000 for 5 contract murders. Millions of doses of drugs sold through his site. An unknown number of overdoses and deaths that could be linked to Silk Road. In the archives that I studied, Ross's letters from prison were preserved. He wrote of remorse, of rethinking his philosophy. He claimed that if he could go back, he would never have created Silk Road. But critics called it an attempt at manipulation for the sake of liberation. The debate over the fairness of his sentence divided even those who generally supported a hard line against drug crime. 2 life sentences for a nonviolent offense? for a website on the internet, when murderers sometimes got less. On the other hand, he created the infrastructure for the global drug trade, made tens of millions. And yes, he tried to order murders, even if they didn't happen. The movement to free Ross gained momentum slowly but steadily. By the year 2020, it was an organized campaign with lawyers, political activists, and a media strategy. They lobbied for a reduced sentence, sought a retrial, looked for any legal loopholes. And then the election campaign of 2024 began. Donald Trump, running for a second term, actively courted the libertarian electorate. Cryptocurrencies had by then become mainstream. Bitcoin had reached new all-time highs. Ideas of decentralization and digital freedom were no longer considered marginal. At one rally, Trump explicitly said he would consider pardoning Ross Ulbricht. The hall erupted in applause. Libertarians got what they had been seeking for years: attention at the highest political level. Speculation has increased since the election victory. Will he pardon or not? When? On what terms? Lynn Ulbricht met with Trump administration officials. Petitions multiplied. The pressure was building. And on the 21st of January, 2025, the first day of his second presidency, Donald Trump signed a full and unconditional pardon for Ross William Ulbricht. The news spread across the internet in minutes. The crypto community celebrated. Libertarians shouted about the victory of justice. Critics accused Trump of populism and undermining the judicial system. Trump announced the pardon in person, calling Lynn Ulbricht. He talked about making this decision in honor of her and the libertarian movement. Called those who secured Ross' conviction scum and lunatics. Linked Ulbricht's case to the general theme of arming the government against political opponents. Ross Ulbricht was released a few days later. He was 40 years old, 11 years of which he had spent behind bars. The world outside had changed beyond recognition. Bitcoin, which cost a few dollars when he launched Silk Road, was now valued in the tens of thousands. Cryptocurrencies had become part of the traditional financial system, and Darknet markets multiplied and evolved. I am not ending this story because it is complete. It will never be finished. Because Ross Ulbricht is not just a story about one man. It's a story about how technology is changing the boundaries between freedom and crime. It's about how noble ideas become excuses for dark deeds. Ulbricht wanted to create a free market where the state could not dictate its will. He believed in a philosophy that put voluntary consent above any laws, and in the sterile purity of the theory, it sounded beautiful. An economic simulation, a world without systematic use of force. But reality is always dirtier than theory. Freedom from the state does not create utopia. It creates a power vacuum that is filled by those with more resources and fewer moral constraints. Ulbricht began as a philosopher of freedom and ended up as a man who buys murders with bitcoins. The worst part is that he saw no contradiction. In his logic, the assassination order was a defense of the free market against external aggression, threat removal, a business decision. The libertarian philosophy gave him moral justification for actions that in any other value system would have been mere murder. And here's the question I ask myself as I study this story. Was Ross Ulbricht a victim of the system or the creator of his own hell? Is the punishment disproportionate to the crime, or does it perfectly symbolize the danger of digital empires without oversight? I don't know the answer. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle. A young idealist who got caught up in being a philosopher and built an instrument he couldn't control. A state that decided to make an example of him and over-sentenced him. A technology that promised freedom but brought new forms of addiction and criminality. Today, as I write these lines, Ross Ulbricht is free. Silk Road has long since closed, but dozens of other sites have sprung up in its place. Alphabay, Dream Market, White House Market, each has learnt from Ulbricht's mistakes. Each became more technologically advanced and paranoid. Ross's story didn't stop the Darknet. It just taught him to be careful. And Bitcoin, with which Ulbricht wanted to free the world from banks, has become part of the very system he fought against. It's being bought by pension funds. It's traded on Wall Street. Nations are creating their own digital currencies using the same technology. The irony of history is that Ross Ulbricht won and lost at the same time. His ideas triumphed. Cryptocurrencies changed the world. But the world that resulted is nothing like the free market utopia of his manifesto. My name is Mr. Dark Web, and I have told you the story of the Dark Prince, the man who used Satoshi Nakamoto's creation to create the first true anonymous empire, the man who proved the dark duality of any powerful tool. The technology is neutral, but the people using it never are. Ross Ulbricht has been given a second chance. What he'll do with it, time will tell. But his first story is over, and it's a story about how the road to hell really is paved with good intentions, especially when those intentions are backed by cryptography, anonymity, and a philosophy that justifies any means for a greater purpose.